Good morning, everyone. We're in hybrid mode for sure today. Mayor Freeman is remote. Evan, are you with us? He was there. Maybe I did that. Well, they're 3 minutes late. I'm leaving. So,
The old 3-minute rule.
I worked in college, right? That's true. That's true. Well, why don't, not trying to have a coup here, but since we don't have a chair or a vice chair, I'll get us started, and when Kevin jumps back in, we can pick that up. We are here today for a workshop. PTAC is presenting its initial recommendations on allocating the population among jurisdictions. And I'm going to turn that over to Heather.
Heather's on.
Is he back?
There he is.
Oh,
Yeah, apparently there was a connection issue with my phone, so I switched to my laptop. Good morning, everyone. My apologies for being remote today. So we have work to do. So
being in your absence, I hope that was all right.
no, please soldier on.
Heather?
Oh, good morning. Does everybody have coffee? I've heard there are some council meetings, commission meetings last night, so it might help. So I'm Heather Trotman. I'm planning director for the city of Railway Heights. I currently am the chair of the PTAC, which has representation from each of the communities that work on technical issues on behalf of the steering committee of elected officials. And we are here today to talk a bit about the recommendations of the PTAC and the deeper dive with regards to proposed population allocation amongst communities in Spokane County. So about 2 meetings ago, we began discussing that there was a recommendation initially from the PTAC about going with the Office of Financial Management's medium range recommendation. And at that time, we answered questions of the steering committee, and the steering committee said, go forth PTAC and look into this a little bit deeper. And so our committee has done that. We do have a small PowerPoint presentation to go through that identifies the methodology of the PTAC and recommendation of this allocation process. And I will say that we did get feedback from each of the communities as part of that from the PTAC as we move forward, and that spoiler alert, we're recommending a 2-part process for this population. So if we go to the next slide. We began working on this back in 2023, so it's taken a number of meetings of the group in order to come up with these recommendations, and we work closely with other agencies in order to come up with the background data. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So just a summary, we did form a subcommittee of the PTAC in order to do this work because they were meeting more frequently than the PTAC in order to do this deeper dive into the data. So we did have representation from Cheney, Liberty Lake, Medical Lake, Millwood, City of Spokane, Spokane Valley, Washington State Department of Transportation, Spokane Regional Transportation Council, and Spokane County all participated in this conversation. So just as a primer, the PTAC is actually open to participation by these other agencies. And remember, we're also working on regional coordination. So it really makes sense for us to have all of these additional voices at the table as we work through issues of updating the periodic updates for each of our agencies, and as we work in regional coordination for elements that touch all of our jurisdictions for the county planning purposes.
Good question.
Yes.
In the end, others, have you reached out to the tribal plans or?
Actually, yes, both tribes currently participate in PTAC, and the subcommittee is open to them to participate. We regularly have attendance from one of the tribes that are here, the steering committee of elected officials, and regularly at the PTAC meetings as well. Good question. All right, and with this, I'm going to hand it over to Mike. I'll work with Spokane Regional Transportation Council. He was one of the subcommittee members who worked on the formation of this recommendation and has some technical background on the data for you as we move forward. So please feel free to ask questions. This is what today is all about, is answering any pending concerns you might have about the population allocation, because this is the very first and essential step to set all of us up for success in doing periodic updating. We all have to have a goal toward which we are planning toward, and this touches all elements of our comprehensive plans as we move forward. With that, hand over to you.
Good morning, everyone. As Heather said, my name is Mike Ulrich, and I'm a principal transportation planner at the Spokane Regional Transportation Council. And I was asked to present the PTAC's recommendation on the population allocation to the steering committee of elected officials. So let's start with the assumptions that inform the recommendation. The recommendation assumes the OFM medium population, which is the steering committee of elected officials has recommended to the Board of County Commissioners. I understand is under consideration by that body. That forecast would result in an additional 100,000 new residents through the horizon year of 2046. So this exercise is, of course, focused on where to allocate those people so that the local jurisdictions can plan to accommodate them. The principles that the subcommittee relied on are to keep the allocation process simple and justifiable, while at the same time minimizing the need to make any ad hoc adjustments. That is, so to the extent possible, the same procedure is applied to each jurisdiction the same. So as the subcommittee considered those principles, we evaluated 3 different options. A trend-based approach that started with the 2010 OFM population and developed a trend line out to 2046 to calculate each jurisdiction's population. We considered the feasibility of SRTC's land use allocation tool, which SRTC uses to forecast population for the purposes of forecasting transportation demand. And we also considered other population data sources, including the US Census and ACS data products. Ultimately, we determined that the OFM data is the most appropriate. The SRTC land use allocation tool really isn't the best tool for the job. That tool is intended to forecast population at a different geography and was based on the older land capacity methodology, not the one that was most recently adopted by the Board of County Commissioners. The decennial census data was too limited, and the methodology behind ACS data made that an impractical choice. So all of that discussion led us to the following proposal. You can see it laid out here on the slide. First, I think the most important point of this whole presentation, and Heather alluded to it, this is what we're recommending is a 2-step approach. So there's step 1, which I'm going to lay out in a moment, and ultimately we'll come back later with a step 2, which will offer the opportunity for further refinement. So in round 1, we're recommending, and Heather spoiled it, we're recommending the adjusted trend-based approach that Heather and I both laid out. The intent of the two-part approach is that once the planning work required by GMA and other state laws complete, those numbers can be refined in round 2 using available capacity, availability of services, those sorts of things can be used to adjust that population in round 2. So before we talk more about those refinements in round 2, I just want to talk about how the adjustments were made and why they were necessary in round 1. So the main thing to keep in mind here is that there is a control total that the countywide population cannot exceed. So each jurisdiction was adjusted in the same way to account for that control total. That is, and you can see it on the slide here, all of the jurisdictions were adjusted in the same way except for 4. When you calculate that trend line that I described for each community in the region, the communities of Fairfield, Latah, Medical Lake, and Spangle are forecasted to have negative growth. So instead of assuming that those communities will shrink, the recommendation set Fairfield, Latah, and Spangle's growth to 0. Medical Lake was a little bit different, and the subcommittee and ultimately the PTAC treated that a little bit differently in that we didn't actually adjust their trend, but instead used the population that resulted from the trend line without an adjustment for the control total. This was based on feedback that we got from Medical Lake during our conversations with the PTAC, and it results, as you'll see later, in a modest growth for the community of Medical Lake. The bottom line is that there were some adjustments necessary that the PTAC felt were pretty common sense items that could be tweaked later in round 2. So to elaborate on how each jurisdiction's allocation could be refined in round 2, We've got some examples of those considerations here on the slide, but ultimately we'll need to consider things like critical infrastructure, new regulatory requirements like House Bill 1220, and ultimately, of course, feedback from the jurisdictions. All could be used to make that refinement in round 2. So some things to keep in mind as you consider the PTAX recommendation. The allocations were based on the best available data, and that's relative. I don't think it's fair to say that this was great data, but it's the best data that we have. So as we discussed, there will be an opportunity to fine tune these numbers before they're adopted for use in the comprehensive planning process. And even after they're adopted, there'll be a review period in 5 years where further refinement will be possible. So that brings me to the populations themselves, and you can see that on the table here on the screen. And there's also one in the last page of your packet. If you want to refer to that table, don't feel like you've got to take all this in right now. I'm going to come back to this slide at the end, so you'll have an opportunity to really digest this in a couple slides here. So you might be wondering, how these populations compared to when we went through this process the last time. And I'm going to show you a comparison here in a moment. But overall, the growth is higher this time around. Just the raw number of population that we have in this allocation process is higher. And the shares, that is the amount of growth that's allocated to each jurisdiction, or the proportionate share of that growth, is relatively the same across all of the jurisdictions. There's a few exceptions, and I would characterize those exceptions as minor, that you can see here on the slide. And I'm not sure if the folks online can see my mouse, but I just wanted to point out Liberty Lake, the city of Spokane, and Spokane Valley are the only jurisdictions that have a share difference that's greater or less than 1%. So with that, Kevin's on. I can turn it back over to the chair to guide the discussion. I'm happy to take questions. Heather's here. We've got members of the subcommittee that are here to address questions. But with that, I can turn it back over to you, Chair Freeman.
So I will just let Mr. Chesney run it while he is there. So Scott, what's the next thing we need to get to?
Discussion of the information that Mike and Heather put together. Oh, Kitty's got her hand up.
Please.
Thank you for this. This memo was really well put together. So I'm just checking my assumptions here. It's not that it wasn't clear. So when we found that the unincorporated UGA grew a lot more than expected and the rural area did not, when we changed how we think about that area, was the shift into the whole UGA, or did you put all of that remainder into the unincorporated UGA?
I might lean on some fellow subcommittee members for that one. Maybe I'm not totally clear on the question. Kevin, did you catch that?
I'm not clear on the question either.
So there was a section in the memo that talked about how the rural area did not grow as projected last time, and there's considerable difference. And so I don't know, I assume assumptions were changed there. Did it just get reallocated to the unincorporated UGA, or did it get spread across? Or did it just change a whole number?
It's, that difference between last round and this round for the rural area was based entirely on, this round is based entirely on what OFM reported that population is being over.
Okay.
So it wasn't any kind of an assumption that was applied. It's just in 2017, they assumed a certain amount of growth in the rural area. OFM has reported much less growth in the rural area, so that trend in that section was small, or was relevant.
Mm-hmm. And then it was just reallocated to the whole system.
It means that the whole system absorbed that growth in other places.
Other questions?
I'll let you see if anybody online.
Anybody has questions, please raise your hand.
We're not seeing anything, Kevin.
So it looks like there's stuff for us to digest before round 2. Scott, do you have any recommendations from your side with the planning group?
Well, we were here, looking for comments and ideas from the steering committee to take back to PTAC. Clearly, I mean, PTAC has a methodology. They've got, we have a group ready to go on round 2, and we're certainly prepared to move in that direction if the committee feels that's useful. And we bring something back at the May meeting for sure. Joel.
Did you look at the estimates from the previous 2020 or 2000 estimates that were put together as part of that process, see if they were accurate?
You're talking about which two
The
thousand?
original 2000, when we did the original comprehensive plan, population allocations.
You're at-
Those actually projected, did those cities or counties actually meet those projections?
So you're asking if we went back and looked at what we forecasted back then and
Yeah.
compared it to actual?
Yeah.
I don't remember, Kevin, if we did that at the subcommittee level. I will say that OFM has, in this most recent forecast, adjusted the steepness, so to speak, of their trend line upward. In reaction to, I think, a higher growth that we experienced over the last 8 years or whenever the last time they developed their last forecast for GMA was. So they have reacted to a higher growth rate based on that OFM medium forecast.
I was just looking at individual jurisdictions, what they actually performed, they said they had this kind of, they had available land. Did they actually develop that land in that period of time? That's my question, because
Yeah,
saying you have the land is great, but if you're not willing to allow it, that's a different story.
yeah, and I'd probably just, to get a clear answer on that, I'd probably defer to some of the jurisdictions that are in the room. I'm not sure the answer to that, so maybe some other jurisdictions have an answer.
So I can answer that in parts. The first part is we just adopted a conference plan in November of 2023 and we exceeded our allocation of population. We had been projected less than 3%. As you can see by the trend, we were closer to almost 7%. But I would say that each agency, as they move forward with their land analysis for the phase 2, that will be part of that process of seeing how much they grew, how much land was consumed for residential, how much was consumed for industrial and commercial as part of that preliminary report. So the answers may be pending for each of these agencies to identify if they hit that target, they exceeded it, or they were underneath that.
Councilmember Cathcart.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how much weight is given to current or recent growth trends in these projections. And then I agree with Joel. I would love to see some projections to actuals from the last round. And then the last thing is just if we could get that round 2 document in advance of the meeting so we can kind of think it through a little bit before we join together again. I think that'd be really helpful for me.
Yeah, so I can try to take the first part of that, the question. So the forecasts or the allocations were developed looking back to 2010. And so I think it's fair to say that each year since 2010 was weighted equally, right? It's just a simple regression analysis from 2010 to 2046 and then adjusted to match the control or to equal the control total. So we didn't weight any particular year or any series of years any differently than any other. It was just a simple regression from 2010 to 2046.
Chairman Freeman, would you want to open the floor to public comment? Oh, I'm sorry, Judge.
I just got one more. When you look at the grid, kind of the table that you have the slide up. When you look at the change for when you're looking unincorporated outside UGA, unincorporated inside UGA. I mean, those are the two biggest shifts as far as higher or lower. You've got for outside UGA, you've got 16% lower. Inside, you've got 13.5 higher. I mean, is that normal to see shifts like that? I mean, this is my first time going through the big. Is that normal to see that large of a shift?
Well, I don't
Like that. I mean, because all the other ones are 1 or 2% within zero change. I mean, essentially. So, but those two being the largest change, is that normal?
Yeah, and I'd look to Kevin to confirm this, but this again is based on the OFM data. And so I think to fully answer that question, I'd prefer to take that back to the PTAC and we can look into that and look at years past and figure out if that's normal or not. So I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but again, this is just based on the OFM forecast, right? So that's really a question of OFM's methodology too, and we could also take a quick look at that and see if that has any answers.
Okay.
Kevin?
If you don't mind me adding just one little thing to
Sure.
that. So the OFM reports on these are not their projections forward. They're not their forecast. What they are is every jurisdiction every year, in fact, I'm doing it right now for Spokane, reports their permits. And so and their demolitions. And so it's based on that number and that estimated population every year. So in the case of the shift between, in 2017, the allocation was more in the rural than in the urban, in the UGA, that is the outside cities. It just didn't happen. The development that was expected in 2017 didn't show up in permits, and so that growth was less outside the UGA. So it's all based on what actually happened in those previous years, rather than something necessarily forward-looking.
Okay.
So it's not trying to forecast the future as much as it is using the past to inform.
Okay.
So in this case, in 2017, I'm not having been here for that discussion, but the SCEO, the adopted allocations in 2017, overestimated what was going to happen in the rural areas.
Yeah.
What actually happened in the rural areas was much lower. That's why that shift happened.
Okay.
Yes, so you were going back to 2017 was the start date. when you
The
look at
trends are
population
created back.
Permits.
The trends are created back to 2010. It's nice to go to a decennial
Okay.
census because it's a
Yeah.
hard count. The comparisons, this chart here was just to give a general idea of what was adopted in 2017 versus what we're suggesting you look at this time. So while this number is comparing 2017, the actual trends go back as far as we could go with a consistent size. The other issue going before 2010 is the cities were different sizes then. When you go before 2010, too far, you go back to 2000, Valley didn't exist yet. And so it's difficult to compare that far back when the geography changes.
So just keep in mind that this is only a recommendation for the first level, because we need a target to move forward. Most of this, if they haven't already started doing planning, will kick off on July 1. Because that's when the funding becomes available from the state of Washington to begin the periodic update. We have a hard completion date of June of 2026. So what we're hoping to do is answer the questions of the steering committee elected officials and get a consensus for each of us to be able to move forward with this. And we will come back as requested with a second wave of these numbers fine-tuned to our land quantity analysis, which has a lot to do with Mr. Kern's question about why more growth or less growth inside of the UGA and outside of the UGA. And that's going to come down to that additional analysis, which is going to be capital facilities. It's going to be utilities. It's going to be transportation related. Was there and will there be available water, sewer, and a transportation network in order to support higher densities within those incorporated UGAs, and obviously in some instances for the unincorporated, other than the landrids, they're going to be limited on growth as we move forward. So we want to have a target to move forward with as agencies. And then I need to add from our last meeting, this is not the only touch we will have in the next 3 months. Remember, we also received a housing allocation. So that's the other leg of the stool, which the same subcommittee will go deeper into over the next couple of months, is taking that housing allocation and use a methodology and bring that back to the steering committee around all forms, all income levels of housing by jurisdiction. And these two elements combined with the land analysis will help us understand, hopefully by the end of this year, that fine-tuning component of what each agency believes they will be able to absorb or accommodate as they move forward in their comprehensive plan. Does that make sense? If this number is not by itself, we now have to consider mandatorily housing impacts, how we're going to get that population into housing and all communities. Yes, ma'am.
It's really well discussed right here, the difference between the rural and urban, and that's what my question was about. I'm just trying to figure out how that informs our discussion, our assumptions going forward. I think it's actually really good that that's the way it happened. But I want to know how it informs what we do in the future.
Hey, Jeremy, I'm not sure. As we look at the jurisdiction, will this be, I know our land use, conversation was more granular than that. I started looking at, will I be able to look at North Spokane specifically for population growth? So then we'll be able to look at that. Well, especially the unincorporated UGAs, yes, because we, at least on the county side, when all is said and done, the growth or the growth areas are going to be done in those disparate UGAs individually. Okay, because we have to balance all of that with capital facilities.
Mr. Chesney, do you see any other questions from the committee members out there right now?
Amber?
So, just to summarize, Heather, you were saying you're gonna look at all the new policies or land use changes that each jurisdiction is gonna look at those in the next round that they have made that may change the future of growth, right?
They're gonna go through their land quantity analysis using methodology adopted under the county planning policies. And part of that will get to the question with regards to how much was consumed of land, how much population was absorbed, and then identify how much they have available. And we will be looking at that next number of the ability to do absorption. So as an example, Millwood is in the middle of doing some smaller analysis. And so they indicated that they wanted to come back or two and potentially have a slightly higher number because they're actually contemplating some densification within their corporate limits. So that work, they'll be coming back and showing why more than 49 people, I think they were identifying 200 potentially as a population target for this next update. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I mean, and the other, I guess my other question is, how does joint planning the area, or is there any opportunity for the unincorporated UGA is generally out, you know, it's connected to an incorporated area. How does that joint planning or the, who might take on the services or the capital facilities for those areas? How does that start to play?
The first round of this is in, for the UGAs that are attached to a municipality. Each city has the ability to merge this work with the LCA work and say, how does that affect our need for urban growth area boundaries that are part of our world? In other words, the joint planning areas. Once that that equation is done, the county kind of steps back and checks their work on the overall picture to see that it balances. But in putting together the plan, especially on our side, we will be working jointly with each of those communities to balance what they're trying to grow in and the county's role in administering it, at least in the short run. Our goal, and we've had this conversation with the city specifically, is to try to have an annexation program discussed as part of joint planning over some period of time, whether it's 5, 10, 20 years or the horizon plan, to try to acknowledge that the county should not necessarily be administering urban areas forever. So there's every intention to move that philosophy into the 26th plan. But what this is doing is it's ultimately merging the math of population with the geography of the urban growth areas and trying to balance those.
Because we may find that in some of these areas, we don't have the water or the sewer infrastructure.
That's right.
To accommodate growth, but there may be another jurisdiction that can provide that. So I don't know, it's just pondering.
And we will be doing a lot of pondering, specifically with the special districts, school, fire, and
Yes.
water
Yeah.
that are outside the municipality's control to understand their capacities to serve. It's why we're trying to update the water plan at the same time. We're talking to the schools more than we have in the past. To try to bring those pieces together so that everybody knows what that plan looks like for 20 years.
So this next phase, we're thinking of, you're saying about a 3 month time period?
Actually, in our proposal, it would be toward the end of the summer or the end of the year.
Right,
As I
I'm just thinking
mentioned-
that water plan is really key to knowing if you can support more growth in different areas, right?
It is, and at an earlier meeting of steering committee, we put forward an idea that at least the municipalities that are getting planning funds from Commerce would set aside 5% of that and allocate that to the water plan update. The steering committee seemed positively, disciplined, possessed to do that. We're proceeding along that line. As Heather noted, though, we can't start billing against that account until July 1st. And so we're setting up the interlocals and the other things through our county water folks with the other districts to move that along and be ready to go when we can finally start doing it.
But at least you'd be looking at available land,
Oh, yeah, we're doing that.
but you're saying that the
Everybody's doing
the
that.
state funds won't come to us till July 1st to.
Well, Melissa, she may know better, but the thing we've been working on, at least in talking to Dave early on, is the effective date of billing against that account starts July 1st. We have to get contracts signed. It looks like that we may not even have reimbursements until September, or October, but we can start using those funds in July. That your recollection? Okay. But all of these are reimbursements. We're not just gonna get a check and be able to bill against it. We will have to put together, what we've done to satisfy those things and then get reimbursed.
If I may add, I think that Councilman, Commissioner Walter, has a really good point, which is something we're beginning to discuss at PTAC, is that some of these discussion items have regional importance. And we have been discussing formulating with PTAC organizational meetings in order to have coordination so that we are ready before we have to have the shared data included in our plans. And the point we just spoke about recently in PTAC, well, it wasn't water, it was actually around the new climate change grant, which had to do with the greenhouse gas emission reductions and the vehicle miles traveled, the climate resiliency. Some of these, very much involve Spokane Regional Transportation Council and Spokane Transit Authority, because by ourselves, we are not necessarily able to either identify, adopt, or implement strategies in our comprehensive plan to achieve those new requirements under the legislation. So I think this idea can be expanded to include availability of water and sewer as potentially an area of coordination for discussion coming up to recommendations of allocation of housing and population for UGAs. So ideally, as Scott indicated, he'd like to kick off the water cleaning, but it becomes a critical conversation sometime by the end of this year, beginning of 2025, to understand the availability or limitation of water as we discuss numbers. But we have to start somewhere, which is where I'm coming to kind of as a final ask, is we're hoping at the next meeting of the steering committee, you will have 2 months with the data that you have. We would like to have a vote of the steering committee to move forward with this first recommendation of numbers, because that sets the stage for us to begin in July of targets each agency will be able to work toward for population. And that we'll be able to come back for round 2, which again won't be until closer to the end of the year after we do our land quantity analysis, to come back with a final population recommendation to the steering committee, which again, we would hope would be adopted by the Board of County Commissioners via a recommendation of the steering committee, probably about the end of the year. So we formally have a number we are all moving forward with, and that will be tied with the housing number. So we're aligning our strategies, we're doing it in a coordinated fashion, and it is not a moving target. And the risk is that we succeed together or we fail together. We need to have population number and housing allocation agreed to by agency so that we can meet that 2026 deadline for planning.
Heather, do you see an action item for the steering committee in May then?
Yes,
And
which
that's-
is using this round one recommendation and distribution of population for purposes of us moving forward to be the next step from the slide that showed that we would come back with individual data from agencies about can we absorb that number, or we're going to give back into the system a certain amount of that population and how that potentially could be reallocated through the community.
Chairman Freeman?
So, a couple things. I think this is a really good time for all of us as elected officials to go back to our planning groups and really talk to those people that are representatives to the PTAC, really talk to our planning folks to make sure that we as our own jurisdictions are doing what we are supposed to be doing prior to the May meeting to understand exactly what's going on in this first round of numbers. Also, I would suggest that if jurisdictions have concerns about UGAs that they are adjacent to for maybe potentially JPAs, that they need to begin those processes and begin thinking about if they wish to approach the county. If you do not have a standard JPA or a JPA in place, do you want to do that? It's from my history that the county is a little hesitant to begin a joint planning process without having a joint planning agreement in place because the county wants assurances that that will be incorporated into your jurisdiction if you want to have a say in how that's going to be planned. So I do think as jurisdictions, we have our work cut out for us, and we need to make sure that we all understand what we need to be doing in order to give the PTAC a answer and address our own questions of these numbers. So I would hope we would take the next couple months to do that. Otherwise, Mr. Chesney, if there's no more questions from the committee members itself, I would like to open this up for any questions from participants, either in the audience or out there in the land of virtual.
There seems to be no other hands up here in the room or on screen from the committee, so Ella, is there anybody? Or in the room? Chairman Freeman, we don't see any hands.
All right, so if there are no hands and no further questions from the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to hear this information. Thank everyone for coming out, and I would, as I said, I would go back and get with our planning folks and really understand what, if there are any concerns from our own planning groups, what we need to be bringing back at the May meeting. So at that point, with no further questions and no further
Mayor,
business.
Before you go there,
Sorry.
we have a couple of hands up here in the committee, and we have one person from the audience that would like to speak on the public comment side, so.
Okay, so let's do the committee first, and then
Yeah.
we'll take the public comment.
That's what I was gonna say, yeah.
And forgive me, we also should be approving minutes before we move on to the public comment. That's what the hands were from the committee, so.
Is there are there any members of the committee that have changes or corrections to the minutes as presented? I'm not seeing or hearing any. Do I have a motion on the minutes as presented?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Hearing none opposed, the minutes from the January meeting are approved. And a public comment. We had one public comment.
Paul Crop.
You speak behind you, apologies. So my name is Paul Kropp, my residence is on Grand Prairie, 311, East Vanilla Court. The observation I want to share with you has not to do with the substance here, because you're on an excellent trajectory. The P-tax memo is clear. Yes, it's questionable about where that accretion of population came in the unincorporated areas, but that's the answer. However, folks, here you are, 9:30-ish in the morning, out of the view of the public. Not only that, but the notice for this, the available information to the public is only a week old. The public, should they care about this, and they really should. And it's the affirmation of the county's planning department that the public will be engaged. But here you are in a place where everybody else who might have some interest in this is either at work or in school or at home. You should really consider holding these meetings at a place that is available to the public. Please do that. Please consider that. I made this plea 2 years ago when we started this up. That we really do need to consider holding these meetings at a time and place that is truly available to the public. These are crucial, fundamental conversations, and the public should be able to see you live through it because you're doing a good job. Number two, a week's notice for this kind of discussion available, information available to the public is simply too short of time. I'm not saying it should be 21 days, but it should be longer than. And I hope you and the county will consider when you look at your specific plans for the 2026 period of budget, that you will modify that 7 days. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for your comment. Are there any other members of the public that would like to make any comments at this time? Second call. Third call. Seeing or hearing none, I think our public remarks are concluded. And is there now no further business before us?
Nothing on the agenda.
Then at that point, I'd be looking for a motion from the committee to adjourn. Second? I'll take it as a second. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.